Hey, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Starr here with you. We're looking at Chapter 1, Key Issue 3. So the big key issue, the big question we have here is, why are different places similar? All right, so when we look at different places, one of the big things we can look at is scale. And so it's a little bit different than the scale we've already talked about. Now we're talking about scale on the idea of local scale versus a global scale. And so when we talk about this, something that's kind of a phenomenon that we've seen is globalization. And that's the shrinking down of the world, making things kind of seem smaller. The idea that the world is essentially interconnected at this point. So we look at technology being a big aid to kind of shrink down the size of the world, so we can communicate all across the globe at this point, and we can travel all across the globe. So we talk about this as a space-time compression. The more technology helps us get from one place to another faster, the more it compresses that space and time for us. Economics is also another idea of globalization. We look at transnational corporations like what we see in the picture there. Those corporations and businesses are all across the globe. So we look at like McDonald's or Coca-Cola from the United States, or we could even talk about like Samsung or Nokia from Europe and from Asia, obviously. So we see it all across the globe, these massive transnational corporations that are in the United States, but maybe headquartered somewhere else in the world too. And so we also see specialization then at the local level when we talk about economics as well. So maybe smaller businesses that specialize in specific products for that area. We also look at globalization with culture. And so when we talk about culture, we kind of talk about the standardization of cultural landscapes, or this idea that this kind of westernized or standard culture across the world that we start to see has kind of threatened some of the traditional folk or local cultures in different areas. And one of the big things we see with this as far as conflict is like 9/11. When we look at the conflict between the United States and the global culture and the westernization of other parts of the world, and the other groups that kind of came in, Al-Qaeda and some of these other terrorist groups that were claiming that the United States was threatening their culture and their survival by bringing their culture to those places. And so going a little bit more in depth on time-space compression, again, this is just a term that we use to kind of talk about the rapidly changing connections that we have across the world. And so the improvements in communication with the internet and obviously like flying and air transportation have essentially shrunk the world down. That it used to take days and weeks and months to cross different spanses here, like the Atlantic Ocean. It used to take a month to cross the Atlantic Ocean, where now you can fly across in a matter of hours. All right, or we can communicate from one part of the world to the other in a matter of seconds with the internet. And so here's kind of an idea of that time-space compression. You can see how things have changed throughout time. In 1942, it took roughly a month. 1492, it took Columbus about a month to get across the Atlantic. In 1927, it took 34 hours to fly across the Atlantic. And then in 1962, Glenn was able to orbit the entire world, all right, 3 times in 5 hours. So it just shows you how technology has helped us compress time and space. Now, one important thing we talk about is also distribution. And when we look at how things are arranged across an area of space, we get into this idea of kind of 3 major things. We talk about density, concentration, and pattern. And so when we talk about density, there's 3 different types of density, and we'll get more into those here in Unit 2, but we look at arithmetic density, physiological density, and agricultural density. So arithmetic density is like how many people live in a given area. Physiological density is looking at how well are we using our resources in that area. All right, how many people are there per resources that we have? All right, typically that resource we talk about is land. And then we look at agricultural density as the number of farmers in a given area as well. And so that gives us an idea of how successful and how developed a nation might be based on their agricultural density. When we talk about concentration, we're looking more at are things clustered or are they dispersed? If we have a high concentration of something in one area, it might be more clustered. If it's a lower concentration, then things are going to be more dispersed. There's going to be more room between them. They're going to be more spread out. And then finally, we look at pattern. We talk about the method of organization of objects in an area. It could be geometric. It could be more organic. And we'll talk a little bit about that with cities as well later on. We'll talk about the idea of kind of a geometric grid-like pattern, or is it organic over time and kind of grown up on its own? So we look at the density and concentration and pattern. We can see some of that right here in Canada. So Canada is one of the largest countries in the world by land area, but you can see the majority of population in Canada lives within 200 miles of the United States. And so you can see just how densely populated those certain areas are, most of them living kind of down in around the Great Lakes area right there. One other thing that we can look at here, and this is kind of brief, they just kind of mention in your book, but charting the land, and that we look at something that used to be of more importance, that is the U.S. Land Ordinance of 1785. It divided up all the territory in the United States into kind of a manageable grid-like system so they could sell it easier. And so we call this the township and range system. And you can see that the R stands for range, the T's stand for townships. And so we look at like the Grove Township, and that is the range 40 west. Right, if you look at the top up there, and it would be Township 81 North. All right. And so it's basically a coordinate system similar to like latitude and longitude. And you can see it's broken down multiple times. It's broken up by township, it's broken up by range. And then inside the township and range, there are certain number quadrants as well that show us where a certain plot of land may be. And so we can actually see this pattern of township and range all throughout the United States. All right. When you fly, if you were to fly over the top of a lot of our land, you see that things tend to be in kind of a grid square-like pattern. That's because of our township and range system. And you can see some of those baselines and principal meridians that were used throughout our map to draw some of these township and ranges as well. And there's your evidence right there. You can see all the squares, all the different squares and rectangles throughout our landscape. As like I said, as you fly over the top, there's the township and range. We can also see it here with Minnesota, with the Twin Cities metropolitan area. You can see the township and range system being used. Most of the cities are in some kind of square or rectangle pattern here, except for when you get into some of the ones closer to Minneapolis and St. Paul, or in this case, Ramsey and Hennepin counties. Going back to globalization as well, we can also talk a little bit about the distribution and globalization. Two big aspects here. We look at fast food, and Starbucks is a big one that's globalized as well. So you can see just how popular Starbucks is across the world. Obviously most popular here, but it's also throughout Europe, parts of Asia, and then we can see in East Asia and Southeast Asia as well. All right, so Starbucks are another one of those global transnational corporations. We look at fast food. Here too, we can see again most popular in the United States, but other parts of the world definitely they are using those organizations, those corporations as well. One thing your book gets into here is talking about space. And so when we talk about space, we're not talking about like outer space, but we're talking about like actual general space of where we live. And one thing we can talk about with space is inequality. And there are basically kind of three ideas when we look at geographic thought with inequality. We talk about the idea of a post-structuralist geography. And basically we look at how powerful in a society, how powerful a society is to dominate or seek kind of more control or less control over specific groups. And so groups can occupy a specific space, and confrontations can get in the way of different groups in those spaces. And so one of the examples that we can have here of kind of this post-structuralist geography is the idea of Flint, Michigan. All right, if you remember, Flint, Michigan is the city of Michigan that they had some major issues with water. All right, their water supply was not good, and we look at the community there tended to be a more lower income community that had to deal with the water pollution issues that sparked up. And so we look at one group having power over the other group in this case. We also talk about humanistic geography. This emphasizes the different ways that individuals form ideas about place and give those places symbolic meanings. And so one of those places we can see on the picture on the right there is the Castro district of San Francisco. It tends to have a large LGBTQ community. And so you can see that the street, the sidewalk or the street right there has the rainbow. You can see the rainbow on the street, on the wall right there on the street corner. So this is, again, a neighborhood that identifies as more LGBTQ and LGBTQ friendly. And then finally, we look at behavioral geography, and we look at the idea of emphasizing the importance of understanding the psychological basis for human actions in space. And so all of these things are kind of looked at with behavioral geography. How do we behave in the spaces or the areas or the places that we live in? Here's a green slide for you. Again, this one is not from your book. Remember, anytime you see a green slide, it's something that was not in there. Talk a little bit about the idea of identity, place, and space, and how they all interact together. And when we look at kind of social relations in relation to space here, a lot of places are unique. Every location, every place around the world is unique. Its location is unique, and it may have a different what we call site and situation when we get to that. And so this includes social relations. When we look at these different places, a lot of times we get to this idea of what we call gendered space. And gendered spaces are things like restrooms. They might be places like monasteries or convents. So we look at monasteries are typically for males. Convents are typically for females. We talk about a lot of time places like bars or pubs. A lot of time they tend to be more gendered. All right, it's a much more common sight to see a man kind of out at the bar by himself versus a woman. Right, it's many women probably wouldn't feel comfortable being at the bar by themselves. Same thing with gyms. We see a lot of times might see a gym like Gold's Gym tends to be more male dominated, and place like Curves definitely aimed towards women. All right. So think about gendered spaces. It's pretty common, actually. We think about gendered space all around us. There are certain places where males are maybe more apt to be at versus females, and vice versa. We can also look at ethnicity and how place and ethnicity interact with each other. We talk about a sense of place, kind of infusing a place with a meaning or an emotion. And we look at that, places tend to label themselves with some of these characteristics. And so groups closely bond to a place over time. And if we take a look at like the example here, New Glarus, which is in Wisconsin, they consider themselves to be Little Switzerland. And so they have festivals and music and all these different foods and things that kind of represent Switzerland. A lot of the people that lived there were people that came from Switzerland to begin with. All right. So when we look at Swiss Americans, and in that case, we can also look at like South Asians going to Fairfax, Virginia. And so there's the other places that we look at where groups tend to congregate in those places, and they bring that sense of ethnicity and place together. We can also see sexuality and space interact with each other. And one of those things that we look at is called queer theory. And it is a way of looking at social relationships without the assumption of the straight, white male perspective being the dominant and what they would quote right view of the world. And so when we look at this, there are certain places that obviously we talked a little bit about the idea of the sexuality in San Francisco, right? The Castro district, same idea here. All right. So it's not just based on sexuality, but gender is also a lot of times taken into account when we look at some of these places. So we might talk about mapping same-sex neighborhoods. Loring Park in Minneapolis tends to have a higher group of same-sex couples. We look at the West Village of New York City, same with that. And so queer space or queer theory is what they call this. It's maybe not the best name for it, but that's the term they used for this when we see a higher group of same-sex couples in one area. So we can look at some of the other cities that have higher rates of same-sex couples throughout the nation here. So you can see California, a lot on the coasts. We've got Michigan in there, Florida in there as well. Okay, here's another one here when we look at Marais and Paris. You can see the different areas. And then when we get into this idea of maybe the opposite side of this, you can see areas that same-sex marriage is recognized by law nationally, or recognized as civil unions in other places as green. And then when you look at the other flip side of it, we see where same-sex marriages or couples would be recognized with death or imprisonment for that, all right, and their lifestyle there. And so you can see that strip of red there tends to correlate with the area right there through the Islamic band here in North Africa, and then into the Middle East as well. All right. And again, that's a religious idea. It's a religious cultural belief. And so we'll talk about that later on when we get to religion. Finally, guys, we look at diffusion and how something spreads from one place to another. And so when we look at that, everything starts in one place, and that is the hearth. The hearth is the point of origin. And over time, we see basic types of diffusion that happen that spread things, spread these ideas or goods or whatever it may be from one place to another. One type is called relocation, and that's the spread through physically moving to a new place. So people diffuse religion, language, ethnicity by physically moving to a new place and bringing those things with them. When we look at the other type of diffusion, we talk about expansion, and there's 3 types of expansion diffusion. These are kind of like a slow spreading snowball process. So over time, it kind of builds and builds and builds, and it spreads that way. And so the 3 styles we see of that are hierarchical diffusion, where something comes from a power of authority or a source of authority. So think of things like fashion trends, right? They come from places like Paris, or they come from New York or Milan or Los Angeles. They don't come from Cottage Grove, right? So that we look at the hierarchical diffusion for fashion would come from one of those major fashion cities. We talk about contagious diffusion. We look at disease spreading, or we can even talk about the internet and social media a little bit with this when we talk about like viral, right? A video going viral. And so when we look at contagious diffusion, obviously we're living it right now. COVID-19 is a good possibility of looking at contagious diffusion. We can also look at a previous one, the AIDS prevention. We can talk about maybe the idea of memes and, again, videos going viral as being contagious too. So they spread slowly, but over time, after one person sees it or one person catches it, it continues to spread and spread and spread to other people. Finally, we look at stimulus diffusion, and stimulus diffusion is kind of an underlying idea or innovation, and it's usually spread through some form of internet technology. And so when we look at the idea here of stimulus diffusion, like Facebook versus Snapchat, all right? So we look at Facebook as being an older platform for social media, and Snapchat came around and they brought up ideas that changed social media. And now Facebook is also using some of those same Snapchat filters and ideas and things that Snapchat has done. So an underlying idea or innovation has come up via technology in some way when we look at stimulus diffusion. So here's some examples. We look at relocation. Again, religion's a good one. You can see the larger kind of blob is the hearth, and then you can see it spread out to those other places around there. And so we've got Islam and Christianity, and then we've got Hinduism and Buddhism, again, all spreading from their source of authority or that spot, all right, that hearth, as we call it. We look at contagious diffusion, and probably the best example of contagious diffusion is the map we have right here, and that is the bubonic plague in Europe. All right, during the Middle Ages in Europe, we see that most of Europe was infected, and they say anywhere from a third to a half of the population was killed because of the plague at that time in Europe. And so it was a disease; it was contagious. People got it, the next person got it, and it kept going. And then we look at hierarchical diffusion. Another good example we talked about, like internet and things, but in this case, we're looking at like TVs and hierarchical diffusion coming from the United States originally, and over time, kind of working its way to other parts of the world, as you can see here. So working our way down the map till we finally get to the map at the bottom, which is 2011. And you can see most of the world has some form of television in it. And again, you can see Russia doesn't have any information there. That's why it's grayed out. But yes, the TV has come from the United States, just like internet has come from the United States and over time worked its way to other parts of the world through hierarchical diffusion.